Hello, and welcome to the premiere episode of Commander in Chits, a cardboard reality podcast about historical war games and their historical background. On today's episode, we're talking about Memoir 44, and it's only going to get heavier from here, folks. Enjoy the show. How's it going, Dylan?
It's going good, Scott. It's great to be on the pilot episode of the one and only show,
Commanders in Chits.
I just had to hear Scott say it.
Yeah,
so,
very first episode. Pretty excited about this one.
Yeah, this is a good series.
Yep, and we're going to be talking about a game that you and I have played quite a bit. It is Memoir 44.
Love that rule book. Love it. It's actually just the cover, too, so...
Yes, and in addition to talking about Memoir 44 in general, we're also going to be discussing one of our favorite scenarios and some of the background behind that scenario.
That is... Which scenario are we talking about?
That is number 8, and that is Operation Cobra.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to get my hands on the actual page.
Yes. So if you don't know what Memoir 44 is, this is a game in the Commands and Colors series by Richard Borg.
Mm-hmm. Not Richard Berg.
Richard Berg.
Easy to mix those up.
Yes. This is it's like a squad level game. You're controlling different units made up of minis. Mm-hmm. It's usually like 4 for infantry and 3 for tanks. You move around using these command cards, and then you chuck some dice to see what happens in combat.
And it's a series that varies in like how they represent the units. Sometimes it's miniatures, like they do in Memoir, they do in Battle Lore, and they do in the Great War.
Right.
But then a lot of times, particularly the GMT versions, they do blocks, but they're double-sided blocks, not like you would see in a block war game.
No. And those are like Napoleonics, Ancients, Samurai.
Tricorn as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the main difference, I think, between Memoir and some of the other ones is is how streamlined it is. Mm-hmm. Which you can kind of see why, like when it's like why it has the publisher that it has. Like this isn't really a GMT game,
right?
It doesn't have the granularity, I guess. Like Commands and Colors Napoleonics is much more complicated than this one, though it is the most complicated of all of them.
Right, and these are based on the 2 that we've played. Those are the only 2 we've played, correct?
That is right.
Yep.
Yeah, I've played Napoleonics and I've played Memoir.
We are looking to get Ancients played here pretty soon. Shout outs to Brian.
Yes, Brian or Jonah. We have a few friends that have it. Just haven't had a chance to play it yet.
Yep. I've thought about getting Battle Lore. Unfortunately, neither of us really have an interest in Battle Cry, which is the first one in the series, because it's seen as this level like complexity.
Right.
So, and Civil War isn't something I'm super like jazzed up about.
What are your thoughts on Memoir in general, Dylan?
Memoir in general, this is probably one of the lightest war games I've played, maybe the lightest. Mm-hmm. It is simple. It's easy to get to table. It is outside of setup, like setting up the terrain and stuff. Scenarios play quick.
Right.
It's not a super time commitment. Sometimes you have enough time to get in the initial or like get in a scenario both sides. So you can get like the full like I scored this many for this side, you scored this many for this side, who has the most points at the end.
Right. And that is the way I prefer to play it as well. I prefer to play both sides of every scenario that we play.
Right. It's also exploring the balance, exploring different strategies, exploring different just like how they play out. Because they do play out very different across the, like, if Scott were to play one side and then I played that same side in the second game, they would feel very different.
Yeah, and part of that is the card-driven nature of it. Mm-hmm. Based on the type of cards that you draw to command either like your left or right flank or your center, the strategy that you pursue could be completely different.
Right.
For instance, I think it might have been Operation Cobra, the first time we played, I got a lot of really good cards like General Advance to move like 2 units in every zone. And I played a few of those right off the bat. And so I outnumbered the Germans, which was you. And also, I was able to move way more of my guys right off the bat.
Right.
So the strategy and the arc of the game played out very differently between the two.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of it's going to be due to terrain as well. Like, this is one that introduces a ton of hedgerow and has 0 hills.
Right.
Which is totally different from other of the really balanced scenarios where you have hills that you're almost fighting for.
Yeah, and that is a very common thing that you're going to be doing in this game is fighting over the defensive terrain.
Right.
Holding a forest or a hedgerow or a hill is much better for your infantry than for them to be running out in the open, which makes sense.
Right. And same with like hiding in buildings in towns,
right.
hiding behind the trees. Yeah, it does make sense that like your footmen would want to stay close to the barriers of war.
Right, and that's one of the main defenses against armored divisions, because they take a much heavier penalty for attacking into cities or into forests than infantry do.
Right. What about a little bit background, since we are kind of already talking about Cobra?
True. So Operation Cobra, this started in July of 1944. Mm-hmm. This was a few weeks after the initial D-Day landings.
Okay.
This occurred, let's see, where in Normandy? Probably more towards the western edge. This was a multi-phase operation, sort of. So
Operation Cobra was?
Yeah. So
okay.
Operation Cobra specifically is what we're going to be talking about. But for some context of the situation here, things are looking bad around this time for the Germans.
Right.
During this same time period as this operation, in Eastern Europe, you have Operation Bagration, where almost an entire German army group was wiped out by the Russians.
Okay.
And then right before this operation takes place, there's Operation, I believe it's Goodwood, which was the...
Good name.
Yeah, great name.
Which we are 4 years old.
That was headed by General Montgomery of the British, and the British and the Canadians launched an offensive operation to draw away the German armored divisions from this area for Operation Cobra to make a breakthrough.
Okay.
So before the assault begins, they bombard this area with air support, with bombers and close air support planes to sort of pave the way. And then they launched an infantry assault with some infantry divisions and some armored divisions in the reserve.
The Allies did?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe force-wise, it was 8 infantry divisions and 3 armored divisions on the Allies against around 4 infantry divisions, a paratrooper division, and a couple of panzer divisions on the German side.
Okay.
The Germans, because of strategic bombing and because of how, they're fighting on 2 fronts, and this has gone on, they've been fighting this war for 6 years almost. Their divisions are all undermanned and undersupplied. Really, all they have going for them is the terrain right now, which is the hedgerows.
Yeah, it even says here, and it says General Bradley's intention in Cobra was to get the U.S. forces out of hedgerow hell. Yeah,
hedgerow hell is what they called it. So the hedgerows were so these farms they cleared the land and all that debris and all that composty stuff sort of formed these natural fences between these farms, which were very dense trees that were hard to break through. And it provided a pretty good natural defense for people to defend the area. Now,
this may be a question out of your realm, but is hedgerow a common thing outside of Germany?
So this is actually in France.
Oh, in France. Okay.
Yeah. So this is in France. I don't know how common it is in general. I know that it's common in Normandy because of all the old farms.
Gotcha. Hedgerow is a term I'd only heard in Memoir. So I was like, is that common elsewhere? Because that's not something you hear in rural farms where we both kind of grew up.
Right.
Rural areas.
Yeah, it's not something that I've encountered in my life.
Right.
So yeah. Reasonable question.
No, thank you. I tried being educated this time instead of acting a fool like I do on my show.
Yes. So the offensive kind of got bogged down on the first couple of days. Despite the Germans being undermanned and undersupplied, they still had a pretty good, like, entrenched position. Then later on in the offensive, after a failed counterattack by the Germans, they bring in the reserves, the mechanized divisions, and they make a breakthrough. And what that leads to is the Allied forces make it into Brittany, which is like the little, it's the little pokey part on the western edge of France that sticks out.
Right, gotcha.
And with that, they are able to sort of surround the German line, and the German front in Normandy collapses.
Oh, cool.
That would eventually lead to, this is French, so excuse me, I believe it's the Fillet Pocket, which is how the German army got encircled on all sides. And that was sort of a common thing towards the later portion of the war, was to cause a breakthrough in the enemy lines and then have a mobile force go through that to encircle the enemy. And then after they're encircled, then you mop up.
Gotcha.
You know, you cut them off from their supplies. They're attacked on all sides. And yeah.
It's a pretty common thing to do in war, is encircle.
Right. In World War II specifically, early on in the war, a lot of countries were still fighting a sort of static, using like static strategies from like World War I, where it was like they had a line and they did like a general advance, and you know that was why Germany was so effective early on, is because they
were the first to utilize like the breakthroughs and the mobilization.
Right. Like they had a very highly mobile way of fighting.
Interesting. Yeah, because if you look in comparison to World War I, it's all like seen as trench warfare.
Right. And then in World War II, there's, mechanized, like by this time in the war, there's mechanized divisions with the half tracks, like armored trucks, like, so it's not just a bunch of guys marching to a battle. It's much more, it's much faster than that in general.
I have an interesting question based on the history.
Okay.
And this may be like I don't know if it's an appropriate question for Memoir, but why do we see World War II as more of a focal point as opposed to World War I?
I think it's probably just because the scale is much larger and because they happened so close to each other with a lot of like the same participants as well. So it's sort of like the continuation of World War I in a way.
Yeah, so it's like a part one, part two.
Yeah, it is like a part one, part two.
So why do you think we see it more in board gaming as World War I as the focal point? There's not very many World War I games.
Right.
There's mostly World War II games.
Yeah, and in general, I think it's just because people are more interested in World War II. But also it could be because of the development of tactics can make for more interesting gameplay.
Right.
There's a lot more aerial combat. You have a lot more mechanized and armored combat. So there's a wider variety of troops and strategies that you see, as opposed to World War I, which still was mostly infantry with artillery, and towards the end of the war had some tanks and planes.
Right. Yeah. I always think of it as going back to the trench warfare. Trench warfare isn't the most exciting thing to portray in a game. No. The lines did not move a whole lot. And it's not very exciting, I guess, in a game when like you get bogged down in an attack, but the other player can't counterattack you well enough. And so you both stand there and you just kind of like, all right, well, we're stuck in a stalemate. One of the interesting games about World War I is not even a war game. It's The Grizzled, a cooperative game about surviving in the trenches.
Right. It's about being in World War I, not necessarily reenacting
fighting World War I. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but I just figured I would ask that question since we're on the historical note.
Right. Obviously, I can't speak for everyone, but I think that there's just generally a lot more interest in World War II because of the wider array.
Yeah, and I think you also look at the antagonist of World War II.
Right.
Hitler and the Nazis seem to be a much more infamous villain as opposed to villain as opposed to the Germans in World War One.
Right. In World War One is more like your standard European war, except that technology has improved a lot and they haven't quite caught up yet.
Right. What would have been the prior European major conflict before this?
That is a good question. Let's see.
Because you're thinking
probably the most recent one before World War One would be the Franco-Prussian War between Prussia and France. So World War One is sort of like a round two of that between Germany and France.
By gosh, it looks like we're just like wrapping up all the war. Every single Euro war, it seems like, is just one big continuation of the previous war.
Right. It's like, if you trace it back far enough, it's like, I don't know, some dude stabbed some guy with a stick, and now we have World War II.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's just interesting stuff.
Yeah.
And we're going to be covering a lot of this because this is Scott's show.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
we're going to be talking about war games.
War games. So, Operation Cobra. You've kind of given our background.
Yes.
We kind of discovered that not all the scenarios in the base game of Memoir are balanced.
Not really. It was Omaha Beach, I believe.
Omaha Beach was pretty bad.
Yeah.
And then we always skip over,
Point du Hoc.
Point du Hoc, man, that's a trip. We started to set it up and we read through those special rules and we're like, next. So there are some bad ones in there. And I mean, we get it. Like balancing stuff like this, especially for a lighter war game, is not always the highest priority.
Right. Also, when you're trying to portray history, it wasn't necessarily a balanced fight. And so the truer that you want to stay, the more unbalanced some of these fights would be.
Right, but there's also a problem in that because we looked at Omaha Beach, and Omaha Beach is horribly unbalanced for the axes.
Yeah, like towards the axis.
Towards the axis. Like, they win like 80%,
right.
Which, if you think back on history, that's not how it happened.
No. D-Day ended up being a success instead of a failure.
Yes. So, like, it's interesting that there's... maybe mismatched balance is the way to say it. This is also a little bit of a dated game. I mean, it came out in like 2006.
Before 2010, I believe.
Yeah. So I mean, we're copyright 2004.
Okay.
So yeah, we're not talking about the brand new game that requires balance updates and things like that. This is Memoir.
Right. Well, just because the game's newer doesn't mean it's going to be more balanced.
Right. Well, yeah.
But yeah,
it's what we expect of a game nowadays. Whereas I think back then there wasn't the array of games that we're getting at the the level we're getting today. Think about how many new games we get today.
At least at the weight that this game is, I think that is correct.
Right.
Because this is not a heavy game.
No. This is, like, we've joked about it before on the podcast and with other listeners. This is definitely a dad war game.
Yeah.
This is a game that you could more than likely, if your dad has any interest in history, pull out and enjoy the scenario. And he's just like, this is dash chucking fun.
Yeah. And like, if you do Pegasus Bridge, that's all infantry.
Right.
And so it's very easy for people to get a hang of.
Same with scenario 7, which was, say those names for me.
Oh man, I don't know how to say that.
I put him on the spot. I love doing this to Scott.
I don't know. Let's say Vassieux Vercors. That's obviously incredibly wrong because I don't speak French.
But this is another one of the base book scenarios that only has infantry. It was another one we had a really good time with.
Yeah.
So there are a good mix of scenarios in here as well. And there's also, as the back of the rulebook says, there's Days of Wonder Online where you can get tons of fan-made and even richer board scenarios.
Yeah, and you can also get like statistics on each of the scenarios, which is how we ended up deciding on Operation Cobra in the first place because it is very well balanced.
We did Omaha Beach and was like, we did this at a local restaurant, and Scott conceded and was like, this is enough. I'm done with this.
Yeah, it was the only time I've ever conceded. I was playing as the Allies. I think Dylan had 4 of my units taken already out. And I had 0, and he was about to take the 5th one. So I was like, all right, we're done here.
Yep. So so then we were like, let's just not play these in order, and let's just go straight to a balanced one.
Right. And like, if you listen to our podcast, you know that one of my New Year's resolutions was to play all of the scenarios in this book, which
Right.
I do plan on doing, but I probably won't do it in order.
Yep. I do not blame you.
Right. So let's talk about the scenario a little bit then.
Okay.
This one was 51-49, I think, in favor of the Allies, which is pretty dang close.
That's close enough.
Yeah.
In board game sense, that's quite balanced. Mm-hmm. There's not very many games where you can get a 50-50 without having, even like in some abstracts, you're going to have a distinct advantage for something like first turn,
right,
or first player.
Like whoever goes first is slightly more likely to win.
Right. That's how it is in some games, some abstracts.
Right.
So this one has a 51-49, which is quite balanced.
Yes. So this one, it's first to 5 medals. If you haven't played Memoir, the medals are whenever you wipe out a unit entirely, you take the last unit and you claim it as like a victory medal.
Right.
This one is first to 5. There's also 2 cities for the Allies to capture historically.
Yep. They're objective cities that when you move a unit
Let's
into
see.
the hex, it then captures that and you get a medal. As long as you're on that, or as long as you have a unit on that, it counts as a medal for you.
Yes, and those 2 cities that you need to capture are Saint-Just and Marigny.
Well done, Scott. I don't know if that's well done or I'm just like...
It's probably not well done, but it's
we'll
close enough.
We'll give it a shot. This also has a bridge and a river going into another city off into the corner that really
Yes.
only serves thematic purpose.
Yeah, it's really only there to get the like geography.
And a little bit of shrinking the map.
Right.
It shrinks the map. But that corner is basically down 4 hexes. So you have that as well. A lot of this scenario is going to be the Allied forces attempting to overrun the Axis.
Right. As the Axis, most of your infantry starts off in hedgerows as well as one of your tank divisions. And then you've got like an elite tank division and an infantry division back in the rear as reserves.
Yeah. So for a balanced scenario, it seems quite interesting that the Allies have so many units compared to what looks like scarcity for the Axis.
Right. So the Axis are pretty spread out, and they're also outnumbered. But hedgerows are a very, very good defensive terrain in this game.
Yeah.
To enter a hedgerow, you have to start the turn adjacent to it. You have to stop when you move in, and you can't battle when you move in. Mm-hmm. Also, tanks fire in at -2, and infantry fires into them at -1.
Basically saying that you roll 1 less. If it's a tank, you roll 2 less dice. If it's a infantry, you roll 1 less die.
Right. So it helps keep your infantry alive quite a bit longer. And I find that in Memoir, numbers are not always good unless you get specific cards.
Right.
So if you get something that says like attack all on the right, then it's good to have a lot of guys over there. But usually there's a certain number of guys you can move. So heavy forces tend to leave a bunch of their guys behind. And then you like, once your units get damaged, you pull them back and you try to move the other guys up in front of them to protect them. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the main advantage of having more guys, is that when your units are injured, you can move people in front of them to cover the retreat.
It's also an interesting scenario because if you're able to take a look at the map, I'll just look up Operation Cobra map for Memoir. The left flank for the Allies seems to be almost at a disadvantage compared to the Axis because the Axis have a tank in the hedgerow and they have a infantry in a city,
Right.
whereas the Allies have 3 infantry just standing out in the open. So it seems to be an easy strategy to maybe snipe 1 or 2 of those as the Axis.
Yeah. There is one little difficulty, though, is that the tank actually cannot reach, or actually, can it reach?
It can't. Yeah, it's 3 away. So it can reach the closest one.
Yes. So if you leave your guys there, then the tank will be able to reach them, and because they have nowhere to retreat to, any flags would also be hits.
Right. So that tends to be that was one of my opening strategies as the Axis was to use that tank to net an early kill.
Yeah.
A lot of it is also going to be attempting to protect the objective cities.
Right. Because the allies don't necessarily have to take out the hedgerows. If they can just advance between the hedgerows and take the cities, then that's 2 free medals for them.
Right. So yeah, and a lot of one of the difficulties as the allies, in addition to the left flank, is the poor positioning of the tanks.
Right.
Your tanks are stuck in the back.
Yeah. So this is representing that the armored divisions were kept in reserve with some pretty good reason. There's going to be a lot of fighting in close quarters, in these hedgerows, in bushes and stuff, and like infantry-based anti-tank weaponry does exist at this point.
Yeah.
So you don't want your tanks getting taken out by infantry. Mm-hmm. So that is one reason why they kept them in reserve. Sort of the idea at this point was for stuff like aerial bombardment and artillery and infantry to create an opening and then exploit the opening using your fast armored units to get through.
Right. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've found myself playing a lot of war games recently, but I'm still a little bit iffy on the actual historical bits. Mm-hmm. So it's good to have a specific show like this to learn on the fly.
Yes. One good thing about Memoir, too, and just the Commands and Colors games in general, I think, is that Richard Borg usually puts a little bit of historical background in the scenarios as well.
Except for the non-history-based ones.
Obviously not the non-history-based ones.
Right.
But, like, for instance, it's got a couple paragraphs about Operation Cobra in here. And it gives you a pretty good general idea of what the situation is at the time.
Right. Which is good.
Yeah.
It helps. It's a good educational tool.
Yeah.
When it doesn't have to have that at all.
No, and I think they did plan on this being like something that you could take into a classroom with like some middle schoolers or something and get them to maybe be interested.
Oh, it's definitely a middle school based game. Imagine having like 3 copies of this for a middle school like learning day.
Yeah.
It would go over quite well.
I think it would, yeah. And I believe there is some support for stuff like that. Yeah. Like that was one of the things that they wanted to work on is like, hey, you could, teach some people some stuff about this.
Yeah, which I think is quite an effective thing.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
So, final thoughts on Memoir?
So if you have seen my top 30 games list, I won't spoil anything. I won't spoil it, but I will say, if you've seen that, you know that I like this game quite a bit.
What do you like about it?
I like that it is easy to set up and it's quick to play and it's got some tense fun. You just roll some dice and usually it balances out pretty well, I think.
Okay.
Like the average rolls throughout the scenario means that like nobody's really getting destroyed by RNG. Like even though this game relies solely on dice for combat and also has command cards for who you can order, our games are usually pretty close. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good sign.
Yeah. What are your words of advice to those that are trying to get into Memoir?
If you're trying to get into Memoir, that is actually a good question because I have not considered that because Memoir is so easy to get into for me because it's like a 2.5 weight or something like that.
If not lower, I think it's like a 2.2.
Yeah, something like that. It's only slightly above a 2. The game has good reference cards. Mm-hmm. I'd recommend starting with the first like 2 scenarios, one after the other. And there's got to be good videos for learning this, like because it was a pretty popular game, and it's also not hard to learn.
It's in the BGG top 200, so it's like well liked, well played.
Yeah.
This game also has extensive support through Days of Wonder with expansions.
Oh yeah, a lot of expansions.
You want to talk about some of those? I know they're not ones that you've played necessarily, but there are a lot to cover.
Yeah, so some of them are very hard to get a hold of, but some of the
shouts to the Air Pack.
Yeah, the Air Pack. Some of the ones that you would probably be more likely to find are Eastern Front, probably Winter Wars and Breakthrough.
Yep. Also, maybe Mediterranean.
Yeah, probably Mediterranean as well.
Not Pacific.
No.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck with that one. They all add some more complexity to the base game once you get like bored of it. And like once you've mastered it, the rules, you got it all down pat. They add stuff like mortars and machine guns and half tracks, and they add new cards like the breakthrough cards.
There are a few others like the terrain pack that you may want to get if you're getting into some of those expansions. It just adds extra terrain. There is the Desert Winter board, which is unnecessary, but a thematic flair for the Mediterranean front where you're fighting in North Africa,
right,
and the Eastern Front and the Winter Wars.
Right. Also, the Ardennes in 1944, 1945, like Battle of the Bulge type stuff in the winter. It has some stuff for that as well.
Then you also have some of the scenario, like the envelope scenarios as well, like Battle for Kulkin Goal.
Yeah, I think so.
I picked that one up. I did trade it, but because I don't ever expect myself to be able to find Pacific.
Right, because it requires the Japanese.
Yes. And there are a few others, and those add actually scenario-specific units, like the Kalkan Goal, or whatever, however you say it. They add Jeeps.
Okay.
And they're specific just to that scenario.
Interesting.
So that's a cool thing. And we're also both excited for the new air pack.
Yes.
Which is called...
That is a good question. I don't know.
And the new expansion, which comes out in May of 2019, so next month for us recording this now.
Right.
You may be listening to this later, so it may be out. It's called the New Flight Plan.
Yes, and it's got some little stands for you to put these little planes on.
Yeah, and that's what was in the air pack as well, but this is like streamline the rules. It introduces like actually keeping track of the ammo, which is quite interesting. I read through the rules. Seems they're actually, you can add them to any of the scenarios.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
It doesn't just make it, if I'm thinking correctly, it states that I'm pretty sure you can just add them to any of the scenarios, which is quite cool.
Yeah, that is.
So, yeah. And you can also fire at them from the ground, and you can just like zoom over and attack other units. So, and
nice.
I think you can maybe even blow up the objective cities.
Huh.
So, yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I'm not 100% certain on that. The rules are available on the Days of Wonder website and Board Game Geek, so you can check that out in the file section of the Memoir 44 New Flight Plan.
All right. Well, we'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah. So, overall, Memoir, we both like Memoir quite a bit.
Yeah.
It's highly rated on both of our top 30 games list. So, yeah. Anything else you're looking to cover in pilot episode of Commands and Chits? Commander and Chits. I don't even know the name of your damn show.
No, I think that's all.
Oh, right. Cool. So, thanks for tuning in, guys. Scott and Dylan signing out. Make sure to check out all the Cardboard Reality podcast social media stuff. We got Facebook. We got Twitter. We got our stuff on our website. Read us, watch us, listen to us, learn us.
That's right. We're covering all the angles now.
All of them. Next thing you know, we'll have a math episode covering the angles.
No.
All right, signing out, guys. We'll see you later.
See you in the next one.